people can unmute at least and talk if they have questions later. But I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Good morning, everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Patrick DeGlaris. I am the archivist here at the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. And I'm happy to talk to you all today about remote oral history interviewing. I get to do a lot of these workshops with all sorts of practitioners or students or different people, but I love being able to talk to fellow archivists. So I appreciate everyone being willing to participate. And we've got a pretty broad reach of participants today too. So with that said, we've got a lot of ground to cover. And so you can see by this outline here, I'm trying to address a lot of the questions that people brought up when they filled out the registration. There was that comment, what are you hoping to get out of or hear more about? And so I'm tailoring this to those questions a little bit more, just because with an hour to talk about oral history methodology and remote interviewing and techniques, all those things, it's a lot of content. So I'm gonna expedite certain aspects of this. We're not doing a formal oral history overview today. I'll give a little bit of that and move into some project planning that's important to consider, especially in a remote context, but in general. And then from there, we'll kind of spend a lot of the time on just looking at remote interviewing. We'll talk about equipment, we'll look at some platforms, talk about some questions and things to consider, and then end with some strategies at the end. So if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat. Sarah, like Sarah said, she'll monitor that, and we can hopefully have some time at the end to answer any more specific questions. All right, so a little bit more background on us. We at OOHRP were founded in 2007, and it was this intentional effort to broaden the historical record in Oklahoma and in the OSU archives. So since then, we've conducted over 1,900 interviews, the large majority of those being mostly video. As you can see there, over 25 terabytes of data. And so any archivist in here probably just shuddered at the thought of managing all of that data, but that's what we've been working with. And so we have over 1,400 of our interviews online. And in this past year, over the pandemic, we've done over 130 interviews, with 3 of our projects being completely remote, ranging from internship projects, grad student dissertation projects, faculty collaborations, and then just internal interviews that we've been doing in-house. So that's a little bit of a background where we're coming from today. So I wanted to give this primer of what is oral history. For those of you who maybe don't have a background in oral history, what does it mean when we're talking about this? And so these are some really basic definitions. I'll have some resources at the end where you can explore more behind what oral history is. But generally, an oral history is a recording of personal testimony delivered in oral form. So we can be talking about the recording itself, the transcript of that recording, or the overall research method that goes into that interview. But what makes this distinct are those bolded words, for the purpose of preserving the information and making it available to others. You see in both definitions, the second one being from the Oral History Association, I believe from the Archives and Best Practices, from somewhere in one of their manuals, that access and preservation are what makes this distinct, that those were decisions that were made at the beginning. So this doesn't mean that it's a recording of a birthday party. This isn't a TV show. Like there are distinct qualities that go into making these oral history interviews. And I wish I had more time to spend kind of breaking that down a little bit more. But with that kind of primer, I want to move into thinking about project planning. And so like I said, access and preservation are considerations at the beginning of any project or any effort to conduct oral history interviews. And so to the right here is the oral history life cycle. And you see that what we're going to talk about in just a moment is that a lot of these questions get asked initially. It is an iterative process, these steps that happen, but a lot of this needs to be thought out in before anything happens. If you waited to do the interviews to figure out what's next, you're already behind. So here are a couple of questions I think are relevant for what people were asking in terms of doing oral histories. Things you want to think about. What is your focus? What is your elevator pitch behind why you want to do an oral history interview, or the theme or topic you're focusing on? What is it contributing to the historical record? That question can kind of seem like a tough one to answer, but I think the one way to think about this is if you look up the Veterans History Project at the American Folklife Center, I believe they have over 60,000 audio video recordings with veterans just from World War II. It's like, oh, I think it's over 50,000. And so when you think about doing an interview, adding it to an archive, there is that question of what am I adding? Is there an absence in the record that I'm contributing to? So maybe find a specific angle of that topic. If there are 50,000 veterans from World War II, what are aspects that are missing from the historical record? So there is that initial research of what's been done and what can I add value to. Part of that is deciding who will be involved and who won't be. Again, thinking about the stakeholders for whatever topic or project you're working on, who are the important people to include, either to develop the project or to be interviewed. And with that, who are the people that aren't being included? Are those intentional omissions? Are those because it's outside of the scope, or maybe they're not as relevant to the theme, but to think holistically about what exactly you're doing. This is the budget part. It's important for, I think, everyone thinking about remote interviewing is what equipment you're going to use. That includes, the microphones, the webcams, but also thinking about the platforms you're going to be using. If you're using a subscription to Zoom or Zencastr, thinking about, do you have the capacity to manage all those files? Like I said, we have over 25 terabytes of data. That's a lot to preserve. So you're thinking hard drive space, you're thinking the ability to refresh those files. Do you have a capacity? Not saying you're doing that much in one project, but to build that into the scope of your project. Also another question being, do you have the capacity to process them? So thinking about that access perspective, are you planning on transcribing them, indexing them, putting a catalog record online? And do you have the means to do those steps? And if not, building that into what can you do to offer access? Finally, kind of going off of that, how will the interviews be preserved and made available? That's something we'll kind of be going back to over the course of this talk today. But again, thinking about those things now, do you have an archive selected where these are going to be deposited? Do you have a preservation plan for how you're going to run checksums to make sure the file integrity is intact for not just the near future or the duration of the project, but from an archival standpoint for the long-term future? And one aspect I wanted to touch on was one of the comments one of you made were asking about release forms. Oral history recordings are technically owned by the participants at the moment the interview is done or created. So that refers to both the interviewee and interviewer. So in order for you to have copyright to do what you want with any oral history, you need a release form that formally documents that transfer of rights to the archive or the program. And so that looks like deeds of gift. It looks like, when you think about donor agreements, you need something that's transferring those copyrights. And you need to think about language that accommodates for future use of the interviews. A great example of this is anything done 1990s or earlier in terms of oral history. No one anticipated the internet being what it was today. So that ethical question of, did anyone ever anticipate their interview being shared online, meaning that there's a global audience that can reach it, is an ethical question to ask. So really building out, making the participants fully aware of how the interview could be used now or in the future, and getting that consent at the moment that it's signed, rather than 20, 30 years from now, finding them or a next of kin to get that additional permission for whatever it's being used for. Another thought here is, do you need IRB approval? If you work at a university or any institution that receives federal funding, You probably are familiar with IRB approval or what an IRB is, an institutional review board. Oral history was technically deemed exempt from IRB last year. It was finalized, but the caveat to that is if you're doing any either generalizable research or doing any interviews with vulnerable populations, which are defined as anything from economically disadvantaged, I think pregnant women, prisoners, mentally disabled. There's different things that would make that flag go through an IRB. And so that's something to think about for your own instances. And I'll say, just because it was federally deemed exempt from IRB, that doesn't mean that if you emailed your IRB office that they would just sign off and say, yeah, it's fine. It's still a conversation, a discussion that I think a lot of programs across the country are still kind of fleshing out what that new relationship looks like with oral history. There was one question about how much do you ask or how much do you tell the interviewee before the interview about the process, about the interview. And so I wanted to spend a moment to talk about informed consent. This is, to the right is a sample of a document that we use that outlines the entire project process. So everything that will happen to their interview, what their rights are throughout the process, what we plan to do, where they'll be archived. And what this does is it outlines all of the expectations or all of everything that will happen with the interview from the moment it's created to the foreseeable future. And so I have some bullet points here of other things it addressed. It describes why they're participating, how the interview will take place, any risks in participating, which is particularly important for any remote interviewing. And you think about things living in cloud spaces that are owned by other companies. When you think about data breaches or even release forms existing in online platforms, thinking about the risks to a data breach. What does that look like? And does that impact an interview if there is sensitive information being disclosed? It talks about their ability to place restrictions or withdraw at any point, any revisions they can make or how they'll be incorporated, and finally where the interview materials will be kept. So this is a 2-3 page document that we have them sign along with the project investigator. And it is pretty elaborate intentionally. It's called an informed consent document. We're trying to make them fully aware of what they're participating in so that they are comfortable with and just informed of what will happen with their interview, how it's going to be used, and what agency they have over it now or in the future, 10 years down the road. So this is something to think about for any of your projects, to think about what exactly you're wanting to use their interviews for, any potential interviews, and the kind of consent you want them to have. How much information are you able to share? And in your project planning, this is a good exercise to just build out a lot of this kind of follows an outline of a project. So this is another practical exercise of just thinking through all of those considerations that I showed in an earlier slide. So talking about release forms, I'll spend a moment here to say what that's looked like in a remote fashion. For us, it's kind of spanned the spectrum of options. Physical copies are still perfectly fine depending on people's comfort levels, especially if you're asking for their addresses or any contact information. Maybe they don't want to share any of that online. So snail mail is fine for that. We've used e-signature technology like Adobe Sign, which is a little more protected. It only allows certain access from designated participants. So it's a little more secure in who has access to those forms. There's also Qualtrics and JotForm or other survey platforms that either we've used or collaborators have used to get some of that information. And again, it works fine, it works, but the question is, what are the risks to having those things exist in the cloud, even if only for a short time? And communicating that to any participants so that they're aware of those risks. All right, so now we'll move into remote interviewing. I think this is why everyone really came here today. I love this photo. This is an NPR journalist with a sheepskin over their head in a home studio to record their audio. And I think this is a great example of working with what you've got, thinking through budget and equipment, technical expertise. This is something that I'll say this later, but thinking about how perfect is the enemy of good. And so really wanting to say that the options we're going to talk about scale incredibly. There is no one designated best option for everyone. It's going to depend on your individual institutional context. And a great place to start, hopefully not to scare anyone away, is should you do oral history? Thinking about everything I just said with the amount of intention and planning that goes into it. Is it something you should take on? So questions, whether you're doing them or accepting interviews is, as I mentioned earlier, do you have the capacity to preserve and provide access to them now or in the future? Do you have the equipment to preserve and play back the interview? That's more for legacy interviews and physical interviews, maybe done on tape and other mediums. But do you also have the staffing or legal ability to follow through on rights agreements and promises to the donors? So thinking about restrictions, do they want something restricted until 5 or 10 years after they die, or 30 years in the future? Do they want to be anonymous? Are you able to enforce those and protect their interviews and those agreements for the longevity, for the foreseeable future, the duration of that restriction? And specifically for remote interviewing, it's always a good question to ask, can your project wait? I think at this point, we're a year into the pandemic. I know in our institution here, we just got cleared to do in-state travel again for work, which opens up the administrative option to do interviews, but there's still a lot of, for us, ethical decisions to make in terms of, who's been vaccinated, how long they want to spend indoors. All of those types of questions still need to be addressed, that laundry list of questions to ask. But it's a good question to ask, can your project wait? Is it something where it's not an at-risk, either by age or health or anything else, participant? Could it wait for a later time when it's easier or safer for everybody involved? And again, I'm going to keep putting this question here because I really want us to think about this. Can you ensure the safety and security of your interviewees? That's important to think of from a COVID perspective, but also from the materials that get created. Are you able to ensure the safety and security of their materials? So here's one that I think is an important question. Should I do audio or video interviews? And I really liked one of your responses to our question was really getting at the heart of this, was can you do a good oral interview via remote technology like Zoom? I wish that was an easy answer. I think that depends on what you're using it for. I think it depends on your prep time, your ability to, the equipment you're able to use. There's a lot of questions going into that, but rather than just saying that, I can show you how complicated this process can be. So this is a decision tree that the Oral History Association's remote interviewing task force put together. And it can be intimidating at first just looking at it, but what it does is it does a great job of breaking down a lot of the questions you need to ask. And I don't know if it's readable on all of your screens, but it asks questions of, is it possible to do an in-person interview, or is remote interview the best choice? If it's in person, it says, great, wait to do in person. But you can follow along and it goes through to, do they have access to high-speed internet? Yes or no? Then do they have access to a phone? And so this decision tree is a great starting point for thinking about working with individual participants for what they're able to do. So it both shows you what are your options based on the technology they have in front of them, as well as how to build that into your project as well. And so something I really like about this decision tree as well is it gives you case studies. So I'll link to all of this at the end where you can go through, and I believe Sarah shared that link earlier to the remote resources. So if you clicked on that earlier, you've probably already seen that decision tree. But depending on where you landed on that tree, it gives you these different case studies. And so they did a great job of identifying, based on different equipment setups, different formats of recording, they've identified great ways to conduct interviews, whether landline, cell phone, or web-based. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today, but I think digging into these materials on your own will be a great way to kind of get your specific answers, get more information on and maybe what your context might be looking like. All right, so what can your institution support? I put here audio recordings for a preservation file. You're typically looking at an uncompressed WAV file at either 44.1 kilohertz or 16-bit, you're looking at that is the rate you're looking at for a recommended preservation file. That usually gets you 300 megabytes an hour. A compressed access copy, as you see, is a fraction of that. For video recordings, at least for our purposes, we produce about 13 gigabytes an hour. There is no one preservation standard for video. Here are some options. These are some popular ones that can create, some of them can create uncompressed video, but usually it's a lot of data. You can see there the hike between audio and video is significant. Now with remote interviewing, that's not exactly the case. It goes from 50 megabytes to a gig, but you're not producing nearly as much data, but it still is that question of balancing between cost, both of the equipment itself, but also preserving it, ease of use for who's going to be using that equipment, both for you and maybe your participants, and also the feasibility for preservation. So I wanted to show these standards now to look at when we're going to look at Zoom and Zencastr in just a minute, and we can kind of see how they compare to what we would normally get if we were using physical equipment. So this is a good question to ask for that's going to inform the work that you're doing. What are you really wanting to do with those interviews? Are you a museum that's looking to create an exhibit? Are you a grad student or researcher just conducting research and wanting to find a way to do it? Depending on the questions that you're asking or the answers to those questions will guide what exactly you're wanting. If you're wanting an exhibit, it might be harder to find a high resolution video, but it's not impossible. So it's things like that, thinking about what exactly you want to use it for, and are you able to accomplish that goal with the remote equipment available to you? And so I've included here a couple popular options. A shout out to all the bloggers and influencers and gamers who have made a lot of this equipment more ubiquitous and affordable. Anything from the Blue series, you have the Blue Snowball mic on the bottom left, that's $50. We have a couple of those, and they're great for just improving a microphone quality. You have the Blue Yeti there, the pill-shaped one, $100 to $250, that can range from kind of a nano setup to one that has an XLR output that you could use for a physical recorder down the road. You see webcam. I think everyone's probably had to buy a webcam at this point. There's a scaling range of options and features that come with them. But the selfie ring light is something that I don't think I ever thought we would need a year ago, but now something that's essential for if you're doing video, trying to increase the actual image that you're capturing. And so again, a lot of this has become ubiquitous, and you can buy all of it on Amazon pretty cheaply now because of all the other purposes that it's being used for. But these are also great cost estimates, not to think about, not just investing in for your own use, but potentially sending out toolkits like some other institutions are doing, where you'll actually mail some of these pieces to an interviewee to use, whether it's a webcam or a microphone, whatever may be the case. So I don't have time to go over all of the options that are available to you, but I wanted to highlight some. The four that you see here are part of the case studies that OHA has done, so you can go in and see more detailed information about them. We're going to talk about Zoom and Zencastr today, but I wanted to briefly highlight the quick tap device you see there is a great option for landlines. It's about $60, and you plug this into a landline, and you can plug your headphones into it, and it will plug into an audio recorder, a physical audio recorder, and you can record the conversation that way. It sounds like you're on a phone. There's not, you can try to boost that with a lot of different options, microphone options and different things, but it is one way to get a better quality file just doing a phone interview. You also have the Rev Call Recorder, which is from Rev, which is a transcription service. It's a free app you can download and record your audio with. So that's one way to do it if you're on a cell phone, an Android or iPhone, whatever. It does only create an MP3, so it's not going to be that preservation WAV file we talked about, but it is something. And for $1 a minute, I believe it will actually transcribe your interview too. So that's a bonus. I've never used it enough to recommend how the quality behind their transcriptions, but that is an option available with them. All right, I think Zoom is probably the one we've all used the most, and so I'll spend a little bit more time talking about it. Zoom, if you've ever downloaded files from Zoom, you've probably seen it creates an M4A audio file and an MP4. So M4A is similar to an MP3. It's at 32 kilohertz, which is a little bit less than that 44.1 that we were talking about for a WAV file. It is a lossy compressed file. All that means is you're getting a reduced file. It's throwing away data that is giving you often, like you see here, maybe 50 megabytes per hour versus that 300 if you were using a preservation WAV file. Same thing with, so for MP4, it does have a single resolution and fixed frame rate, so it might be 25 frames per second or whatever it is, depending on whether it's active speaker or gallery view, you can get different resolutions. And so these are going to be compressed files. You're not going to get them nearly the size that I just showed you that we create with our camcorders and other equipment. But this is generally what you're working with Zoom. And something that maybe you know, maybe you haven't thought about is Zoom gives you, if you've ever thought, wow, Zoom sounds, it knows how to cut people off or who's talking, and it, somehow background noise gets suppressed. It's all those things are nice for a meeting, but those things are also what is compressing or affecting that file. So out of the box, it's automatically adjusting your microphone volume. It's suppressing your background noise. It's canceling out any echo, and in all of that, it's altering that signal that you're creating on both sides. And so you are able to go in and disable those things, which will give you a more raw file to an extent, which has a small impact on the size of the file. I haven't done enough testing to see the significance in the quality you're getting, but you can eliminate some of those things that it's doing, so you can have a more intact preservation file. It's not perfect, but it is closer to a raw signal. You see here, there is a high fidelity music mode, which disables some of those features I talked about. And it says there, it does raise the codec quality. It does have a big warning that they recommend an Ethernet connection to do this, because the internet connection will have a huge impact on the overall quality. Anyone who's been on a Zoom call that lags knows the effect that your internet connection has on the signal that you're receiving. For MP4s also, there's the option to optimize your recording for third-party video editors. There seems to be some, if you do a local recording, it seems to shrink your file. If you're doing a cloud recording, it seems to increase the size of your file. So I haven't gotten a lot of clarity on exactly what it's doing to optimize your file, but it is in theory supposed to be making it better if you are going to be touching up that file after Zoom produces it. The final things I want to mention are, for Zoom, if you use a free account, you only have local recording, which is great if you don't want to put it in the cloud as a safety precaution, but it does also create a slightly better recording, but it doesn't do timestamps or names if you wanted those. You can't record in the multiple views like gallery or active view. It doesn't transcribe your audio automatically. And so there are things you're not getting if you're using a free version or if you're recording locally. But again, that safety and privacy concern is great. You can save it to your computer, never has to go into the cloud, and that's a great option. And I think the Zoom paid accounts start at about $150 a year, which is like $12 or $13 a month. If you're a part of an institution, it gets nominally cheaper. You can have multiple users under some of those accounts, so you're not paying that much for every for every account, is my understanding. But you do have options like this end-to-end encryption, which generates, it basically only allows the local user's machines to have access or keys to that interview. So even if it goes into the Zoom cloud, in theory, Zoom's not supposed to have any access to those recordings. There is a case study in the OHA resources of using a HIPAA compliant Zoom room or Zoom setup for interviews that were done for the Obama administration. You can look more into that. There are certain features you can disable and record to enable you to do that. But yeah, so that's a general overview of Zoom, what you're able to do with it, some of its features and setbacks. And I want to move over to Zencastr, which is one that we've actually been testing in person here. As I said, this is also one you can see the case study of in the resources. This one, what's been nice about it is in the past 6 months or so, they released a video option. So it's able to actually record video. It used to just be an audio feature. And so that's been able to produce pretty nice results. You can see here the WAV files that are produced. It's 48 kilohertz, which is going to be a little bit above that preservation wave recommendation. It's going to be at that 16-bit depth, which is meeting what the recommendation is. It's at 768 kilobytes per second, which the files aren't going to be as large as the ones that we would produce on our audio recorders that we have, but it is at least getting it to that WAV format. It's retaining enough data where you're getting a better quality file, which is great. Thinking about preservation standpoint, it's great to create a derivative copy from that. You're working with more data and a better quality file. For video, it records in a movie format. There is different resolutions depending on your setup, and the bit rate is variable, largely due to internet connection. And so I want to highlight those two dialog boxes you see to the right. The one on the left is the video file that it produced for just our interviewer in-house. You can see the frame width, the frame height. You can see the data rate. It's at about 6 megabytes, which is streaming quality for a lot of people, whether it's shows or whether it's bloggers or whatever it is. It's at a pretty good bit rate for what you're wanting for digital video or remote video. The frame rate's a little higher. The audio in just the video itself is also hitting a higher sample rate. So that's great. All those, we'll look at a sample of it. It's a great quality, but you look to the one to the right and it's the quality's less, the bit rate's less, the frame rate's less. And that's a result of our interviewee's internet connection. That the thing Zencastr does is it creates a signal straight from, directly from your device. So it's recording it locally straight to their computer, which then will upload to the Zencastr cloud. So it's an uninterrupted signal, but it still suffers from the internet connection. So their overall quality of their file is going to be a little less than the stable Ethernet connection we had in Office. I'll have another slide about Zencastr I'll show you, but one of the things that Zencastr, the setbacks of it have been, it is a little pickier than Zoom. It wants you to use Google Chrome, Brave, or Microsoft Edge. It's not compatible with any other browsers. It wants you to have enough free hard drive space because it temporarily stores the recordings to the computer until you end the interview. And it wants a stable connection, especially if you're doing video. It wants at least 5 megabytes, preferably 10 megabytes per second, in order to get a clearer video resolution. Here's a picture of, or just a screenshot of me in the Zencastr interface. This is right after an interview test was done. So you can see a picture, you can see me in the middle there. If you look at the bottom, you see two different tracks, one that's OHRP and one that is a participant. And what's nice about Zencastr is it saves those, since they're direct signals from the different computers, it saves them as separate files. So you're able to get a WAV or movie or MP3 file from either participant and store those. And especially if you think about the different environments that people are in, one background noise for your interview is different from yours. You can actually edit those separately and then put them together later. So that's a great bonus to what Zencastr does. It does allow you to produce your podcast. This is a podcasting tool, or it's intended for podcasting. It does allow you to, it'll mix it for you. It'll add some effects like a noise gate and different things and give you a combined file if you wanted a really quick access file of the combined interview. So that's a really great option too. Like I said, it's picky where sometimes we're not able to use it with certain interviewees based on their connection, or if certain warning flags come up when they're testing if it's compatible. But when it works, it can work pretty well. And something I didn't mention, it starts at $20 a month for the unlimited wave recordings, video. You get about 12 hours of post-production, and they have a free version that gives you a trial of the video. I think it only allows you to save as MP3, but it at least is an opportunity to get a feel for what the platform's like. All right, so I wanted to show an example of both just so you can kind of see a visual representation of what these different qualities look like. And so this first one is an interview of Zoom using the active speaker window, where it's going to switch between having a focus on one speaker at a time rather than having them side by side. So here's a brief.
Hi, I'm Madison Williams with Oklahoma Humanities, and I'm here to talk with Amber Sharples today about her experience on the Oklahoma Arts Council and her experience with Oklahoma Humanities. So to go ahead and start off.
Okay, so this probably doesn't look any different than your usual Zoom interview. You know, it's a little grainy, it's clear enough. And you know, you wouldn't think twice about it if someone told you this was a Zoom recording. Now this is one from our interviewer, so it's going to be a higher resolution than the participant, but here's what is possible if you have a stable enough connection.
Today is April the 20th, 2021. My name is Tanya Fincham, and I'm with Oklahoma State University with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program in the library. With me is Derek Joyner. He is a 2003 graduate of OSU and was a student.
So hopefully you're able to see that there is a visual improvement. The details of just her face, of the environment, come in a little clearer. The audio doesn't sound as compressed as Zoom would. It's hard to do a great side-by-side test, especially like this, but hopefully you can see there is a better quality or detail to this recording than the other one. And so that's again just showing you the options that are out there. It comes down to, you know, what you're able to afford or what makes sense from a technical standpoint. Zencastr being a little trickier, requiring a little more demanding from an internet standpoint. So wrapping up, because I want to have some time to ask, to kind of talk with you all at the end, any questions you may have. Here are just a refresher of some of the tips that I would recommend for a better quality remote recording. So definitely recommend scheduling a pre-interview to test the internet connection, to talk through their environment and their frame. You know, if their webcam is kind of cutting off half of their face, or if there's a window behind them, you know, addressing some of those issues to kind of maximize or optimize the environment if it's a video interview. To do a mock recording to just test that everything worked well, especially if you're using something like Zencastr that can be trickier, or just to test what their quality looks like with their internet connection. And something I didn't address, but is definitely important from an oral history standpoint, is it's an opportunity to build rapport as well. That's one of the big questions of what's being lost doing everything remotely over email or Zoom or phone calls. There's less opportunities, or maybe it can be more difficult to engage with your participants, to make them feel comfortable with what's going on. And so that's something that really trying to find ways to engage with them, to make them comfortable, and to smooth the interview process as much as you can. Thinking about, again, determine whether to use cloud-based or local recording options, both for your interview recordings, your release forms, thinking about privacy and security concerns and safety for the interviewee. Use an external microphone and headphones. You're gonna eliminate a lot of background noise. You're gonna eliminate echo. You're gonna just improve the quality that you can, even in those compressed Zoom files. It's still gonna have a better audio source. And if possible, consider sending out that equipment to narrators. Depending on your budget, a lot of those, you know, a $50 microphone can go a long way in improving the quality for a narrator. Something that I saw in one of the case studies, I believe it was Columbia University, is they had a permanent third person who coordinated all the technical aspects of the interviews. They were there to do the equipment checks when the interviewee and interviewer were present. They sat in on all the interviews to make sure if anything happened that they could troubleshoot in a moment. That might sound above and beyond, you know, maybe that could be uncomfortable for the interviewee, but when you're worrying about all the questions you want to ask, when you're worrying about being respectful to your interviewee, having less responsibilities or burdens on you goes a long way. We've had people forget to hit record or stop recording when they did an interview because they were worrying about all the other things that go into interviewing someone for a project. Finally, my last recommendation here, use an Ethernet connection whenever possible. Obviously, that's not, you have less control over that for your interviewees, but working with them, going through that decision tree of what they have available to them will at least help you know if neither of you are using an Ethernet connection, maybe Zencastr is not the option. Maybe you're going to stick with Zoom or just use audio and know that you know, you're not going to be able to produce that highest resolution video. But it goes a long way. You can have the best audio setup, all of the equipment you want, spend hundreds of dollars on microphones. If your internet is unstable or not at a high enough bandwidth where it's able to sustain the digital or audio, all of that equipment to a certain extent isn't going to give you that highest resolution file. So that's something we've learned the hard way over our interviews is our interviewer can sound great, but if the person on the other end is from their cell phone, their quality is going to be what it is. We're not going to be able to control that. So that's definitely something you want to think about. Again, when you think about your products, is this just for the archive? Is this for an exhibit or a documentary? And kind of use your judgment and what's available to you to make those decisions. And like I said, remember that perfect is the enemy of good, in that we would all like to have the absolute best setup to record everything in the highest resolution. But if you have to use a Zoom recording, if it's going to be compressed, if it's, you know, that's the reality. If it's something where it's important to document that interview, to document, you know, to create those records, and that work needs to be done. And so don't fret on to an extent the quality that's going to be ultimately produced. And so with that, I'll end with some resources here. You can go to our website to learn more about some of the work we do. The Oral History Association has great resources on oral history best practices, on remote interviewing resources, archival principles and best practices. Really a lot of great work done in the past few years to get these resources out there for archives, for practitioners, but also for interviewees to see what they're signing up for. Then you have a couple of resources here for those people who asked about oral history methodology, getting into it. Doing oral history is a great guide. Oral history manual is a good option for just the holistic view of the oral history process. And then for those asking about ethical or legal considerations, John Neuenschwander's Guide to Oral History and the Law is a pretty popular text in the oral history field to kind of give you a primer on everything you need to know. But with all that said, it looks like we've got about 13 minutes left. And so I would love to open it up to questions or thoughts. If there's anything more you want to hear about, I'm happy to answer, to do what I can to help.
While you all are thinking whether there's anything specific you want to know, I had put something in chat, and Patrick, I think you can talk a little bit about this too, but sort of making the decision on what system is going to work best for you obviously is this balance between like what I can accommodate as the person hosting the recording and what the opposite side can accommodate, you know, with access to equipment. But I know there was some question about doing like end-to-end recording so I mentioned a little bit in the chat about these double ender recording, right? So like Zencastr, which records locally and then records locally, and basically then like pulls those files directly off the local computer and then sort of reunites them. So like the host can have access to both. But there's also systems you can cobble together. Of course, they started drilling right when I started talking. There's systems you can piece together with like a handheld recorder on each side, right? Like or an Audacity on both sides. But the other side of the person doing the interview, like if I'm interviewing Patrick, he would have to be comfortable enough to pull up like an Audacity and hit record at the same time I pull up Audacity, and then he would have to be comfortable to save that file and then deliver it to me somehow. So that gets really complicated, but it's not impossible. So it just, this is the hardest part. We can tell you how to do a really good quality, but 90% of the people that we're interviewing, this is obviously not their thing. They just want to be comfortable enough to be like, where's the link I clicked to see you, right?
And going off of that, I had too many slides already, so I didn't get into preservation or workflow topics. But when you have, for us, if we're collaborating and there's 20 people outside of our office doing local Zoom recordings, that's wrangling 20 people to upload those Zoom recordings. Or if a narrator is recording it locally, that's also another step of, I need them to know where to find it and how to send it to me. And so that's another, depending on the scope, you know, if you're doing 3 interviews, that's not a big deal if it's just you, but depending on what you're doing, that there are those other considerations of how am I going to get all of these files and you know, in a timely manner before they just hide somewhere forever on a computer.
Susan, it looked like you had a question. Did you have a question?
I was just going to offer, hi. I was going to offer as another solution for if both people are using Macs, or if you want to do a local thing while doing Zoom, Audio Hijack Pro I have used to do like, not necessarily interviews or anything like that, but sometimes I've done attend Zoom-based seminars and I want to keep my local copy of it. And so you can choose what audio format it is. There is an issue that I have found, like there's some setting, which is it going to record what I say to my mic? And I've just done this through the built-in mic and not any additional thing from my laptop. But there's an issue with latency of, you know, it's in one, if you're going to record your microphone, I'm sorry, I'm sort of composing this thought on the spot. If you're going to record your microphone, then you're hearing the audio coming through, and then it goes back into your microphone, and so there's latency. But because it's a stereo recording, it's in one channel, and so, and I've done that just as a for something else, and so you have to. Yeah. Work it all through if you're going to do that for an oral history interview.
When we started using Zencastr, when it was audio only, we were recording audio files in higher quality audio and using Zoom to visually connect. So we were visually connected on Zoom. And with Zencastr, you could go in and select how you were connecting over VoIP, which helped solve that latency. But headphones was the biggest thing, right? Like if you're combining 2 different systems, because that's our biggest question is like, how do you want to connect with me? And then how do we want to record the conversation? And the 2 are not always the same. So that falls into exactly what you're saying. You can combine these, but you have to sort of think about as much as you can separating the 2 out and either minimizing who's using VoIP or making sure that you have those headphones and other things so it doesn't create this weird feedback cycle of recording too many places.
And kind of going off of Susan's recommendation, that was a great option too. There are other, there's obviously many more options outside of what I mentioned, and there's a lot more covered in those remote resources. There's some similar like screen recording things you can do. Some of those are native on Macs or Windows. Some of them you can download and it can do that for you. So even if it's just in QuickTime, I believe on Macs, you can also record your screen or set the parameters. So even if it's just you're recording the video of a Zoom call, like that's another option or another backup copy. And I'm not exactly sure on the specs for what it's giving you from a archive, like a preservation standpoint, but there's a lot more available that can be no cost based off of the equipment you have.
Do you all feel like this is something you're ready to start thinking about, or is now you think it's like too much? Too many considerations.
I think this has been very helpful. Thank you.
Glad to hear it. And I'm curious, a lot of you from UCO, is there a project coming up, or are you in the works of planning something, or is it just serendipitous to have so many of you here today?
I think Nicole Willard just really wanted all of us to participate and learn a little bit more about oral history and remote interviewing as an option specifically. I'm not sure that there's a specific problem on the horizon, but or project on the horizon, but just learning.
That's great. I'm glad you all made it.
For all of your information today.
Well, we're still doing remote interviewing, and I think looking forward, we're glad that this will be a continued option for us, even as we sort of resume being able to do face-to-face interviewing again this upcoming year. But even just over the course of doing this, technology and systems have changed so much that every time we kind of feel like we get into a rhythm, something changes up and we have to reassess and rethink. So it's not, these conversations won't continue. Won't stop continuing, which is not a terrible thing. And Patrick, because he deals with the after effect of the files and wants to make sure that, what we are bringing in from the archive and preservation systems is something that fits within the systems we're trying to set up, is the one that sort of most of this falls to. So all this is to say is, if you all are starting something or you're continuing on and you want to chat with us about any of it, we're happy to just share our experience. We don't know everything. We love learning new things, but we're also just really happy to bounce ideas around and see if there's solutions that make sense.
The thing you'll hear all the time in oral history circles is a year, but pre-COVID, remote interviewing was, you didn't talk about it. There was a phone interview you would do, there were certain situations you would do it, but over the past year, there has been a scramble to create a resource guide to how does this work, because it's changing everything we ever thought about our field, and forcing us to kind of come to terms with the option. And so it's been a learning process for practitioners across the globe, really, and especially from an archives perspective too. It's added another layer of questions to ask of what we're trying to do and collect. So
all right. Well, we really appreciate your time. I know this was a lot of information that was hopefully sort of built in to frame out some of the bigger questions that you can think about if you haven't already. And like I said, you can follow up with us at any time. I will send back out an email following up with some of the resources that Patrick mentioned, or that I added in the chat, and also with a link to the recording if you all want to follow up. So thanks again for your time. We appreciate you all showing up. I love the Zoom wave. I'm a Zoom waver. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.